Hello and welcome everyone to the ActInf Lab guest stream number 7.1, 007.1, actually, very nice number. It's May 28th, 2021, and we have some very special guests on today who I will let themselves introduce themselves, and then we'll go into a presentation followed by a discussion. So any and all questions and comments just put into the live chat during the presentation, and I'll be compiling those so that we can make sure to ask them. So please, Miguel, go for it.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I'm Miguel Aguilera. I'm working as a postdoc since a year now at the University of Sussex. And you Chris want to say?
Yeah, so my name is Crystal Buckley. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sussex in both the Sussex Neuroscience and Sussex AI groups. Interested in sensory motor control in general.
Cool. So, Miguel, share your screen. I'll resize it, and then we'll have a presentation take as long as you'd like.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Really happy to present our work here. It's been really kind of fast because we just released the preprint a few days ago, but it's cool to have the opportunity to do this discussion online so far. Okay, let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep. So, and I'll resize it now. So go for it.
Okay. So this work. So this is a preprint that we have just published. So Miguel Aguilera and I wrote it with Brent Milic, Alexander Sanz, and Christopher Buckley from Sussex, but except for Brent that's now in Oxford. And so the work tries to focus on some of the recent publications about the free energy principle. I guess most people watching will know that the free energy principle was conceived originally as a unified brain theory, integrating experimental data and trying to describe the relationships between action, perception, learning, and so on. And more recently, the theory has evolved and try to become more general, stating that any non-equilibrium dynamical system under some special conditions can be interpreted as performing Bayesian inference, and this will be a broader theory of living system, or a way to describe how certain living systems behave using the tools from Bayesian inference. And okay, so this is kind of, so in principle, this kind of schema of how a brain is predicting an environment could be used in different systems like a cell or different living beings. And well, I imagine anyone familiar with the free energy principle have seen this kind of pictures a lot. And we're trying to do different ones. And so I think it's maybe a good thing to try to visualize things in a new ways, because these ones have been repeated so many times. Okay, so the idea is, so we are interested in exploring the different assumptions behind the principle, because in theory the free energy principle applies to very diverse systems, but in practice there has been very few attempts to explore all the steps of the theory in specific systems. And what we want to do here is just that. We want to understand the free energy principle and its mathematical assumptions in the simplest system, in the simplest non-equilibrium system that we can find. And this is a linear Langevin dynamics that I will explain later. And under the assumptions that the couplings between elements are weak. And in this very special case, we can compute all the relevant variables analytically, and this will be this is a very interesting case for studying in depth all the mathematical details. Okay, so the work I'm presenting today is related to the latest publications around the ideas of the FIP, the monograph of free energy for a particular physics, and the most recent paper by Thomas Lance and Carl about Markov Blankets, information geometry, and stochastic thermodynamics. And specifically, we want to focus on two questions. The first question is how general is the free energy principle? That is, from all the systems that we can imagine, can capture aspects of biological systems, how many of them conform to the assumptions that the principle requires? And the second question is, how informative is the principle about the behavior of a system? So if a system, if the first point holds, so if a system conforms to all the requirements of the principle, then how much do we know about the system, right? How much the principle is able to inform us about the behavior of this organism. Okay, so and in doing this, we find two issues that I will explain later in detail. One is that some of the requirements of the principle are make it challenging to find systems in the class of systems we explore that match the required assumptions. And the second issue we found is that one important step in connecting the behavior of the system to the gradient of the free energy described in the principle involves decoupling from the history of interaction of a system, and this creates problems for an interpretation of a system behaving as if minimizing a free energy. I will explain that in detail. So before starting, just one quick note on the notation we are using, which is a bit different from the papers and some of the literature. We are describing external sensory active and internal state with this C, which is composed by external states Y, sensory states S, active states A, and internal states X. And here, also differently than in the papers, bold symbols represent vector and matrices. So expectations instead, which were bold in some of the papers, here are represented by these M variables like MY, MS, and so on. And sometimes the theory uses conditional expectations given a blanket state, and in this case, the blanket state, the conditional state is going to be between parentheses. So this is the mean of Y, the mean of external states given B. And also we can compute time derivatives as usual, and we will represent marginal flows as these F variables that I will describe later. Okay, so first we try to summarize the different conditions and assumptions that one needs to derive the free energy principle. And I'm going to make a bit summary, which will be useful for later. So first, the free energy principle assumes we have a system that we can describe as a Langevin stochastic differential equation, and this is just having a noise term, this omega, which is just random and uncorrelated, a white noise, and some flow function f that could be any potentially nonlinear function that describes this time derivative, this evolution, this deterministic part of the evolution of a variable c. And in principle, the covariance omega is a Gaussian term, and its covariance is just a diagonal matrix, gamma, because all the noise is independent between elements. Okay, so the first condition that the free energy principle requires is that the flow function decouples what it's generally called autonomous and non-autonomous states, meaning that internal states X are not going to influence external and sensory states, and external states are not going to influence active and internal states. And this is what we generally expect from a sensory motor loop in an agent. And so if we have we represent this evolution of the system like an Euler integration. So the external states do not influence active and internal states do not influence external and sensory. Okay, so we are going to require restrictor analysis to systems that have this sensory motor structure. The second condition of the principle is that this system has a global attractor. That is that the probability distributions of the state of a system converge to some specific probability distribution, which is called P. And this P can be described by the surprise, which is the negative logarithm of the probability, which is how surprising or how unlikely is a state. And this condition proposes that This global attractor or this steady-state distribution can be described by a decomposition, a Helmholtz decomposition, or well, an AO decomposition, which relates the flow function with the surprise via two matrices Q and gamma. Gamma, we saw it before, it was just the covariance of the noise. And Q is a matrix capturing what's generally called the solenoidal flows in the system. And Q is it's asymmetric, and the solenoidal flows of the system mean that it capture the non-equilibrium influences in the system. If a system is at thermodynamic equilibrium, then Q is going to be 0 for all elements. But if the system has an exchange of matter or energy, or have some asymmetry in the interaction between the parts, Q is going to be non-zero. Okay. Okay, so we are going to have these diffusion terms, gamma, which are these dotted lines, and then we are going to have couplings between elements with these solenoidal influences that are captured by these blue arrows here, these wiggly arrows. Okay, so that's the second condition, and the last condition that the free energy principle requires is the Markov blanket condition. This is, yeah, maybe very well known, which requires that so that the sensory motor states S and A, which are generally called a blanket state, that we are going to call V, comprising the two. So the condition requires that this variable are going to play a very special role, the coupling internal and external states, in the following way. And they are going to, if we compute a conditional distribution fixing V and of external and internal states, these states are going to be independent for a fixed V. So they are not independent in general, but they are independent for a specific blanket state. Okay, so we can, yeah. So if these arrows are conditional, are statistical dependencies, the given V, we have Y and X, but they are not statistically correlated for a given V. Okay, and in this sense, these blanket states are going to be like a boundary or a barrier between external and internal states. Okay, so these are the conditions required by the free energy principle in our view, meaning that these are the prerequisites that we require. So for a system to display the properties proposed by the free energy principle. Okay, but aside of that, we interpret that the theory has some 3 extra assumptions. So these are not conditions, these are not prerequisites, but things that the theory expects to happen or expects to find, at least in some cases. And for explaining this, we still explained before how the theory proposed that variational free energy is involved in the behavior of a system. So the free energy principle proposes that any system under these conditions that I described can be seen as minimizing, or as if it's going to behave as if minimizing a variational free energy. So for defining this free energy, we start with the surprise of the blanket state. So the blanket state is what an agent can observe in the environment. The agent cannot access the environment directly because of the sensory motor structure that we have, but only can access the blanket states, the sensors and the actuators. And if a system is behaving as if minimizing the free energy or doing Bayesian inference, a system is going to behave as if minimizing the surprise of this state. And okay, but a system cannot access this probability distribution directly, but because it cannot access the environment. So instead of that, Bayesian inference prescribes to use a lower bound of this surprise, okay, which is called a variational free energy. And this variational free energy consists on the surprise term plus some divergence, some KL divergence between the actual probability distribution of the environment given the blanket and a model Q, a simplified model of the environment. And Bayesian inference consists in finding the parameters theta of this model that minimize this distance. So in this, so when this distance is minimized, then the agent has a model of the world and is predicting the states of the environment Y. Okay, so solving the Bayesian inference problem. The simplest way of doing it is just doing a gradient descent minimization of this free energy, which ends up in being a gradient descent of the surprise of the environment Y at the most likely state theta and blank. Okay, so here just theta just parameterizes the most likely state of Y. Okay, so then the free energy principle defines the most likely states of the system and the environment fixed in a blanket, just like the mode or the argmax, but sometimes it has been proposed that the mean is enough for doing this. And since we are going to use linear systems, the both are going to be the same. So you can interpret this M as the mode or as the mean of Y and X given B. And then you can, if you remember, we have these flow functions F. You can compute the average flow of the system Y for a given B, and which we saw in this assumption that can be described by this matrix Q and gamma and the gradient on the surprise. So if we want to find something like the gradient of the surprise that we have here, the free energy principle proposes that we have to compute the average of the flow given B, and we obtain something like this. And we can see here that the first term is just what we want, is the gradient. It's related with the gradient of the surprise, but we have some extra terms. And so if we have some gradient like this, we could, if we had something like the first term in this equation, we could interpret, we can use this gradient to perform, we could use this gradient to perform a minimization of this energy, which if we interpret it strictly, it could mean having some variable theta that follows this gradient. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay. Okay. So if we have some, okay. So and the free energy principle suggests that this parameter theta is going to be the most likely states of external or then internal states. And I'm going to so we have this equation here, this equation 12, and we just need the first term. So in general, the free energy principle proposes that the couplings of this matrix Q, are going to be 0. Okay, so this is each element in this diagonal is a block, can have a number of dimensions, and the free energy principle assumes that one interpretation is that it assumes that removing these solenoidal couplings, these non-block diagonal couplings, then we are going to remove these elements that we don't want, and we are going to have a flow of the system equal to this gradient on the surprise, that is the gradient that minimizes the free energy. Okay, so this is the first assumption. If these Q terms are equal to 0, then we have an average flow that goes in the direction of minimizing the free energy, and this is interesting because we will have a system that points in the direction of the free energy, and I will explain that later. However, in some works, it is proposed that there's a more general form of this matrix that is also block diagonal, but not within Y and S and A, but within autonomous and non-autonomous states, so Y and S and A and X. And this has been referred as the general case, but it's not, for us at least, it's not that clear how you can derive in this case this gradient of the free energy. And it's suggested that the solenoidal couplings can cancel out, so we are going to consider the two cases, but consider in principle just the case of a complete block diagonal matrix. So this first assumption means that the solenoidal couplings between elements are or can be approximated as 0. Okay, the second assumption is okay. So we have a flow of external states that's pointing in the direction of minimizing the free energy, but we want to interpret internal states as minimizing this free energy. So what the free energy principle proposes to solve this? So the proposal is that there is a smooth mapping sigma that connects the most likely internal states with the most likely external states. So this my is equal to sigma x, and the assumption is that there's a gradient there's a gradient or there's a derivative of this mapping that exists. So the mapping is differentiable and that it is invertible. And they propose that a sufficient requisite for this assumption too is that the mapping from V to Mx is injected. Okay, and so if this mapping exists, then we can connect the external states with the internal states, and we know that the external states have a flow that points in the direction of minimizing the free energy. And so the hope is that now internal states, if this mapping exists, are going also to have a flow that's pointing in the direction of the free energy. And the last assumption, and this is maybe more controversial, is that if one have a strict interpretation of the gradient descent of a free energy, the assumption will be that the dynamics of the most likely states are approximately equal to the average flow of the external states. So this is the derivative of the average states, and the right side will be the average of the derivative to some. So this is saying something like this. No, approximately the derivative of the average is going to be equivalent to the average of the derivative, because the flow is just the time derivative of the system. And if this assumption will be true, then not only the flow of external states point in the direction of the free energy, but also the dynamics of the system are minimizing the free energy. And this is interesting because if we had this, if this is true, then we have some equation like this. So the derivative of my is equal to the gradient respect to my of this surprise. So the dynamics of my are behaving as if minimizing the free energy. So if this equation 20 is true, we know that the dynamics of the behavior of the system is going to be actively performing a gradient descent on the free energy. And if this is true, and we have the mapping that assumption 2 proposed, then we can use the chain rule to find a connection between the derivative of my and the derivative of my. So the dynamics of the external states and the dynamics of the internal states, just with the gradient of this sigma function. So this is just a chain rule of derivatives. And with this step, then we can describe the dynamics of internal states as the dynamics of external states and use this gradient mapping to reach this equation 23 that tells you that the dynamics of the most likely internal states is doing a gradient descent on the free energy. So this is the end of the argument of the free energy. So if this is true, then the internal states will be behaving as if minimizing the free energy about external states, and then the internal state will be behaving as if effectively performing Bayesian inference. Okay, and well, we derive that from some of the steps in these publications in the monograph of a particular free energy for a particular physics, and the most recent paper by Thomas about Markov Blankets, information geometries, and so on. Because they, or at least it appeared to us that they were using the same symbol for the derivative of external states and the average flow. And because, so in some equation, there is a connection between so for the chain rule, they use this symbol, and well, so this is why we interpret this in this way. However, and also from conversation from the authors, it's proposed that the free energy principle is not exactly proposing that the behavior. So an interpretation of the principle will be that the system is not doing a strict gradient descent as this assumption 3 that we label with this star, because it's in part our interpretation, but that an alternative to this assumption *3 will be assumption *3, which is that it is not the derivative of the most likely state that follow the gradient of the free energy, but just the flow, the average flow. So the average flow of Fy is just the average of the derivative of y given phi, the conditional average with the conditional distribution, and the claim will be that if the flow is pointing, so if the average derivative is pointing in the direction of the free energy, then you can interpret that the system is behaving as if, on average, it was performing a gradient descent. So this assumption *3 will be that not that the system is exactly doing a gradient descent on the free energy, but that it is doing on average. If we will have like many observations of the system, then we could see that they on average point to a minimization of the free energy, but maybe not if we just observe one system individually. Okay, and then this assumption *3 will be that, yeah, exactly that. If the conditional average flows follow the direction of gradient descent on the free energy, then the behavior can be described on average as if minimizing the free energy. Okay, so this is a summary of the different conditions and assumptions of the principle, in which we could have competing interpretations at some points, like this assumption 3. Okay, this is a lot of steps, and it is hard to intuitively have an idea of how we can expect from any of them. So what we did is we tried to explore these different conditions and assumptions in a very easy system to solve, and see what we can expect in this very simplest case. So our idea is the best way to really understand this is to have a toy model, the simplest we can have, and see how easy or hard is for the different assumptions to be held by the system. Okay, so we substituted the Langevin dynamics that we had before by just a linear Langevin dynamics. So everything is the same. And well, we have a factor for the noise, but this is going to be just one. And we have now the f function, the flow, is just substituted by a linear multiplication. So we have a matrix J, which is an invertible and real, which is multiplying the state of the system minus some constant rho, which is just going to be an offset capturing the average state in a steady state. Okay, and this system is going to be a non-equilibrium system if the matrix J is not symmetric. Okay, so in that case, we are going to have a non-equilibrium system, and we are going to have, like, for example, spiral flows and so on. And the interesting thing is that this system has a steady state. If we let the system run for some time, it's going to have a steady state that's going to be a Gaussian distribution, because if everything is linear and the noise is linear, eventually the system is going to reach a steady state Gaussian distribution. And in the limit of time going to infinity, the average of this Gaussian is going to be just this rho parameter, and the covariance matrix of this multivariate Gaussian is going to be this sigma star matrix. And this sigma star matrix cannot be solved analytically, but it's the solution of this equation 29. It's an equation that involves the noise, the covariance of the noise gamma and the couplings J. And if in equilibrium, this equation can be solved analytically, but we are interested in more generally in non-equilibrium systems, and this equation is called a continuous Lyapunov equation, and in principle it can be just solved numerically, which is not ideal for us because we want to have the connections between the parameters and the matrix, but we cannot in general. Okay, so what did we do? So in order to have a solution of this equation, a general solution, we assume the following. We assume that the couplings of J can be defined as some diagonal term I, and this is negative just to ensure the stability of the system. So if I is positive and large, then you will have a diverging system. And then we have non-diagonal couplings C, and we assume that these C terms are small. So if we have C squared or C to the power of 3, these are going to be negligible terms. And in that sense, we can, so if we have that, we can solve this equation in terms of a power series expansion. So we can have like a, so this will be equivalent to a Taylor expansion that you can see in calculus. And we can have an expression of this sigma, the covariance matrix of the solution, in terms of increasing powers of C. So we have here the linear term, the quadratic terms, and some cubic terms that we are going to ignore. Okay, and to make things more easier, we are going to assume that the noise is homogeneous. So sigma is just identity matrix times some constant, some scalar constant. Okay, so so we choose values of so if y, so the conditions 1 and 2 are almost automatically true. If y is negative and larger than c, we have a global attractor, and also we can define j to have the sensory motor structure that we want. So we go directly to condition 3. So condition 3 is the Markov blanket condition, proposing that the blanket states or the sensory motor states play a very special role, being a boundary between external states and internal states, so that the conditional distribution is an independent distribution. Given the blanket, y and x are independent. Okay, so in a Gaussian distribution, this condition is true if and only if the Hessian matrix, which is the inverse of the covariance, satisfies that the Hessian between y and x, the Hessian between internal and external states, remember that this can be a matrix if the dimensions of y and x are more than 1, is equal to 0. Okay, so we can very easily compute what's the form of this Hessian with these approximations. So we have the question, how common are Markov blankets? No, from all the systems in the world, how often can we expect, if we have just random parameters, to find a Markov blanket? Okay, so we want this matrix H, which is the inverse of the covariance of the steady-state distribution. And we can express this inverse again as a power series, and this is called a Newman series for computing the inverse of a matrix. And it has this form. We have, again, a linear term and a quadratic term and some cubic terms that we're going to ignore. Okay, and so we just need to know C to know what's H, and to know if this corner of the matrix is equal to 0. Okay, so C is going to be like this because we impose these specific sensory motor structures in which external states don't influence internal and internal don't influence external and so on. And so for the first order approximation, we have this equation 36. Okay, so for a first order approximation, we just keep this term of the equation. And we can see, which is C plus the transpose, just switching rows and columns. And we can see that if we sum C plus the transpose, the term in the corner is going to be equal to 0, which is what we want. So for a first order approximation, we have an exact Markov blanket, and the Markov blanket is always going to be true. So this is good news in principle. However, if we want more precision and we compute a second order, so we get these quadratic terms here, we find that the corner of the Hessian, the one that has to be 0, has this form. So in principle, this is not going to be 0, or is going to be 0 just for very special cases. And if we look at the connectivity structure of the system, so the kind of sensory motor loop that we require in general is this canonical loop at figure A. So in principle, for this structure, very few systems are going to have a Markov blanket because this is not going to be 0 exactly, almost never. However, there is some other configurations that are going to have a Markov blanket. If we have a circular loop, like this case B, or we have something like this structure in C, then the terms appearing in this equation are at least one of them is 0 in both cases, and this is going to be 0. So V and C are going to have a Markov blanket in general, but not A under a second order approximation. And so under this canonical flow constraints, so case A, only a few systems are going to display unexact Markov blankets, although but one exception are going to be these circular loops or these symmetric loops. And however, to be fair, we have to say that in the case of weak couplings, the Markov blanket is still going to be a reasonable approximation, because if we have some equation like this, and so the first term, so even if we have something like this is a second order equation, and all the other elements in the matrix are going to have first order components that are going to be much larger. So even if we do not have an exact Markov blanket, it's going to be a reasonable approximation in most cases. Okay, so this is condition 3, sorry. So let's go to the next. The next one is assumption 1, which states that the solenoidal couplings between blocks of states have to be 0 in order to have a flow that points in the direction of the free energy. Or we could relax this assumption and have these larger blocks, but also requiring some zeros in here. So we can rewrite the previous solution of the steady state equation to find a connection between Q, gamma, and J. And doing that, we reach, rewriting the previous equation, we can reach this equation 40. Again, this equation cannot be solved directly in general, because it's another continuous Lyapunov equation. But assuming that we have J equal C minus Y, and the couplings are small, as we had before, we can do the same trick and have a new power series that connects Q with the values of C. Okay, and has this form which is similar but a little bit different than the case before. Okay, so but this case looks a little bit more complicated. So first, we just computed the first order expansion of Q, and it looks like this. So this is Q for a first order case, ignoring the quadratic terms of C. Okay, and again, we see that there is, in principle, few cases where the assumption is held exactly, because we want to make 0 all these terms here, and if we don't constrain the possible parameters, this is going to be true only in very, very special cases. And we can see that one way to make 0 many elements of this matrix is assuming that they are symmetric. If C ys is equal to the transpose of C, so if the connections from sensor to environment are equal to the connections of environment to sensor, then this is going to be 0. And in that case, we obtain this matrix, which has a lot of zeros, but still there is these terms that we cannot get rid of. So if these couplings are not 0, then we don't have the assumption of the free energy principle, and this is important because this will be the connection from actuators to the environment, which in principle is something we could expect in many cases, and this is the connections from sensor to internal states, which is also something we expect in most sensory motor, or we intuitively expect from a cognitive system with a sensory motor loop. And if we want to make these elements of the matrix equal to 0, then we need to have something like this loop C, in which these elements are symmetric, the J's, the non-diagonal J's are symmetric, and also we remove the connections from sensor to internal states and actuators to external state, which is intuitively a bit strange, but I think in some of the literature of the free energy principle, this kind of loop has been used. And it has proposed that this could represent, for example, the membrane of a cell that separates the internal and external states in this kind of symmetric manner. Although I think there is some research on cell membranes indicating that asymmetries in membranes are still important. So this could be still a potential issue for finding systems that have this block diagonal queue. And if we consider the second order approximations, things become spookier. We have many terms, and we see that these elements are just going to be zero in a very narrow set of cases, which is potentially problematic for asserting that the principle is general for it. These assumptions will be general for many systems. And this also gives you an idea that we are studying this very special case with very weak couplings, but having stronger couplings in principle will make things more complicated and not easier. Okay, so this is assumption one. We only are going to get this block diagonal under very specific circumstances, and the only exception being this symmetric loop with this very special structure. And so this is so in conjunction the Markov blanket exploration and the exploration of these horizontal couplings will indicate that under the class of systems that we studied, the free energy principle will only emerge exactly for a very narrow set of systems. Okay, so this is in principle so interesting to think about how general the principle is, or how can we expect it to be found in different classes of systems, although we just restricted our analysis to these linear ones. Okay, so the second assumption, and connected to the question of how general, not how general, but how informative the system is, the second assumption is that we have this mapping between internal and external states, and if we compute the most likely internal and external states given a blanket for a Gaussian distribution, we can do it very easily to computing a conditional average. So these are the equations. You can find it in any textbook about multivariate Gaussians. And we find that if this requires to compute the generalized inverse of some matrix, and we find that we can, in linear systems, in some cases, if the kernels of these matrices are correct, then we can derive the mapping, but these mappings, if we have the correct dimensionality, will exist very broadly. So this mapping is just going to be a linear matrix multiplication of the relation between M, Y, and MX. So this is good news. In principle, this mapping exists, and it can be expected to be very broad if the dimensions of these variables are correct. Although maybe we should note that in some of the literature, some of the verbal descriptions say that this mapping it's a consequence of the Markov blanket, but what we found here is that they are in principle independent. They could emerge even if there is not a Markov blanket. So at least in linear systems, and also this we discovered that this result was also found independently, but by Lance da Costa in a work that is going to be published soon, and I think that they got to the exact same result as we did. Okay, so going to the last assumption, which is maybe the most complicated. So the last step of the free energy principle was to say that we know that the flow of external state, the average flow y, is pointing in the direction of the free energy, and this means that the system is behaving as if minimizing the free energy. And I described that there is two possible interpretations for this, a strict one and a relaxed one. So let's explore first the strict gradient descent interpretation, which will mean that the derivative of the average of the external states is equal to the average flow. And we can compute that very easily in our linear system. This equation is the derivative of the average state, and this equation is just the average flow. And what we did for comparing both is just generating a dummy variable, this tilde m, which behaves as equally as the average flow. So this variable tilde m will be a variable that strictly minimizes the free energy. right? So this is the real dynamics of these most likely states, and this is what these most likely states will do if they were exactly minimizing the free energy. And under our weak coupling approximations, we can see that we can get to a simplified version of these equations, and we can see that both of them are a bit different. First, the real dynamics has a noise term because the fluctuations are going to affect the dynamics because the observations of the blanket are driven by noise. So this is going to be a noisy dynamics, and this is not. And the second difference is that this term changes the sign here. So here is positive and here is negative. And this seems strange, but the reason of this is because this is the real dynamics, which depends on a previous state, and this average flow, it's history independent in some sense. It just depends on the previous state of B, but it doesn't depend on the previous state of Y, so to speak. So in that sense, the structure of the flow of this variable, of the dynamics of this variable, is going to be different, and in this case, this difference is captured by this constant that has a different sign between one and the other. And if we run a simulation of both equations, we find that the behavior is very different. So this is the behavior of the real average variables. So this is a system with 2 dimensions, and you have these symmetric forms because we restricted the couplings to plus minus 0.1. And if we represent this tilde m, so this is the system that strictly minimizes the free energy, we have this very, very different behavior, which has this kind of a random walk, and this is because this variable is integrating the fluctuations of the other one, and so the error keeps accumulating, and the behavior is very different. So in principle, it's unlikely that and these results were similar for many combinations of parameters, but in principle, it's unlikely that the dynamics of the most likely states are going to be so the average flow is going to be informative about the actual dynamics of the most likely states. Okay, so this is the strict version of the assumption. The relaxed version will be that only the average flow follows the gradient of the free energy. And if we interpret this, we find that there is 2 problems. Or at least we thought that there is 2 problems. The first problem is that a key step of the free energy principle uses the synchronization manifold, so the sigma function connecting external and internal states, and then derives a chain rule connecting the dynamics of my with the dynamics of internal states. And this leads to saying that the flow of the internal states is following the gradient of the free energy. Okay, and so if we say that the free energy does not truly apply to the time derivatives of the most likely states, but just applies to the flow, then we cannot use the sigma mapping to derive this equivalence between what the external states are doing and what the internal states are doing. And so we cannot, so this step becomes problematic. And if we want to connect the flows of internal states and the flows of external states as the free energy principle proposes, then one will need a new mapping, because this mapping and this mapping are not the same. And we computed in our linear system the 2 mappings, and we find that the mapping has a different expression, and it is different from the mapping that's the gradient of the mapping that's used in the literature. So in principle, this relaxed interpretation will require a different mapping that's different than sigma, because we are not interested on the flows of the most likely states, but just on these average flows. And okay, sorry, yeah, and more importantly, another problem arises, which is yeah, sorry. So if we have an strict, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, if we have a strict interpretation of the Okay, sorry, I lost this. Yeah, if we have a strict interpretation like this, like of okay, internal states are following are doing a gradient descent on the free energy. So the temporal derivative is equal to the gradient of the. So this is a definition of like a textbook gradient descent. Okay, and this is fine. If we have this equation, we know that the system is doing a gradient descent. So the question is, if we just have this equation here, so the average flow is pointing in the direction of the gradient, can we really interpret that the system is behaving as if minimizing the free energy? So how informative is this average flow about the real behavior? So we try to explore this. So first, first in these simulations, we see that it may be little it will be little informative, even if we had a different mapping. Maybe this average flow has little information about what the actual dynamics is doing. And for exploring this further, and you can see it in an appendix of our preprint, like the second appendix, we try to explore what is the connection between the average flow and the actual dynamics of the system in a very simple system. So we restricted our system to a bidimensional case with this non-equilibrium behavior. The flows of the system have this spiral behavior, which under noise are going to be rotating in this field. So we have two variables, y and b, and so this is the actual flow of the system. And we ask, okay, so in this system, what is the dynamics of the most likely states? So this derivative of my given v, and we find that we have this negative slope, which is you have this pink area because this is a random variable which is going to have noise and it's going to be noisy and so on. But on average, we have this negative slope, meaning that the system is going to be minimizing. Is going to have an attractor at zero, right? If you study dynamical systems and have a negative slope of a derivative, or at least on average, you are going to minimize. So if the state is negative, you are going to reduce it. You are going to increase it, sorry. And if the state is positive, you are going to reduce it. So you are going to have an attractor at zero, which is what we see in the actual system. But at least for some combinations of parameters, which were like half of the possible combinations of parameters that we tried, if you compute the average flow, it gives you the opposite behavior. Here, the slope is positive, meaning that if you have a system that follows this slope, it's going to diverge to plus infinity or minus infinity. So this is intended as an example that the average flow can be a very poor description of the actual behavior of a system if what you have is a stochastic dynamical system. Okay, so in general, we cannot assume that under all circumstances, the marginal flow is going to be informative as the behavior of a system. And even if you can derive all the steps of the free energy principle, it might be the case that in some systems, the average flow that's pointing in the direction of the free energy, but the system is not behaving as minimizing the free energy. We can see it in this example. The system is minimizing the value of y squared is going to zero. No, the value of these variables is going to zero, but the average flow points in the opposite direction. It tells you that the average flow, if you interpret the average flow as what the system is doing, then you will believe that the system is maximizing the square value of y, for example, because it's diverging. And what it's doing is just minimizing it because it's going to zero. Okay. And so in principle, if the dynamics of the most likely states and the average flow are different, then so they are going to be in general different, and in that case they are not going to be informative about the behavior of a system, except in maybe very specific cases as mean field approximations or this kind of thing. And this difference is because these marginal flows arise from a decoupling of a previous history of the system, and they are not considering the effect the effects of fluctuations Okay. And okay, so just to finish and maybe let's give place to the discussion. In this work, we explore the conditions and the assumptions that are needed to derive the free energy principle in linear non-equilibrium stochastic systems, and some of this has been explored for specific counterexamples, as recent work by Martin Beal and others. But I think it's interesting that we did this for a general class of systems. So it's not one example that we solve numerically, but we solve a family of weakly coupled systems, and we see how general or not are the different assumptions. And so first we explore that. We explore how general are the conditions and assumptions of the principle. And then we studied under what conditions can we expect the principle to be informative about the behavior of a system. And first, we found that the Markov blanket condition emerged at least as a good approximations in the case of weak couplings, but if the couplings are not super weak, are not very weak, then maybe we cannot expect to be exact in general. However, solenoidal couplings are generally present in all blocks of the system, and they are going to be zero just in very, very special cases as this symmetric loop. So maybe a direction for the theory will be to explain exactly what happens when these solenoidal couplings are not zero, and what happens in that case. And so in conclusion, we say that only very specific structures are going to satisfy the requirements to derive that the average flow is pointing in the direction of the free energy. And the second point about how informative the principle is, we saw that the connection between the free energy and the marginal flow of the system with the actual behavior of a system is in most cases very weak, or even contradictory, as one can point in one direction and the other in the other. So we found that in general, these marginal flows are not capturing the actual dynamics of a system, and this is because this marginal flow is ignoring the history of interactions, and we could intuitively think about this. So we can imagine a system that has many trajectories, and if we fix the blanket at some point, it just means having different trajectories that are going to pass through this point, and the average flow is just going to compute the directions or the direction of the most likely derivative at that point. Well, the average derivative of the system at that point. But any individual system can have a very different behavior, which is represented by the black line here. And so an intuitive example for this could be to distinguish between the population of an individual organism and the behavior of an individual organism and the evolution and the behavior of a population. And so you could think that on average, a population of organisms is behaving in a way that's maximizing evolutionary fitness. But this can be largely uninformative for describing the behavior of individual organisms. No? That's sometimes the kind of criticisms that we hear to some proposals in evolutionary psychology and this kind of thing, right? So even if at an average macro level you can detect some tendencies, in many cases these tendencies can be uninformative about what an individual is doing, right? And so we think that it's interesting to think about if and when and in which cases the conclusions derived by the free energy principle are going to be informative about the behavior of an individual or groups of individuals and so on. Still, we have to say that even if we did this kind of critical evaluation, we are still we find that the motivation of the free energy principle is very suggestive, and we think that the aim of connecting ideas from variational inference with the dynamics of complex self-organizing system is tremendously important, as it could allow to apply the machinery of Bayesian and information theory to describe systems that are intractable in practice. But we also think that it's somehow difficult to just derive a theory without a connection to specific models, right? That can allow you to inspect in more detail some assumptions or some consequences of the assumptions that are difficult to grasp intuitively in many cases, right? And also, so in principle, we find that that it will be interesting to that exemplifying the steps of the theory in a specific model is very useful it's very useful to understand the connections between steps and how likely or not are different steps, and that this kind of exercise can be really useful to it can be really useful to understand the kind of difficulties that we face when deriving a theory. And just one, so this is the preprint that we just published, how particular is the physics of the free energy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for this awesome presentation. There was a lot there, and it was incredibly well presented. So for those who are watching live, I would invite them to write questions in the chat. But first, Chris, I'll just pass it to you for an initial comments if you would like. Oh, unmute and then please continue. Wait, Chris, you're muted, and then continue.
Okay. Yeah, so I agree with Miguel that even though we found these flaws in the particular kind of technical presentation we've seen, we still find that the kind of the ambition of the free energy principle is laudable, right? And it's something we really want to embrace, but yet we feel it needs some future development, right? So, I mean, I summarize there's two issues that Miguel has presented here. The first one is the problem about trying to characterize the interaction of an agent with its environment. So you can do this in two ways. And one typical way is to draw kind of connections as direct functional connections between an agent and environment, right? So the sensors and the motors and so on. But there is a different way of understanding those interactions in terms of the Hessian or the covariance matrix, which kind of describe correlations across the system rather than direct connections. And I think what Carl's group has done is kind of really work from the Hessian upwards rather than considering the functional connections that underlie those, right? So he wants to assume there is a Markov blanket and wants to start there. And then he's not so concerned about trying to work out the class of systems that meet those conditions. And I think that's a valid thing to do. It might be a very special set of systems, but I think Carl would claim that's the kind of systems I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in those other systems, right? And what we've pointed out is that we can't find those very generally in a class of systems. And the second major issue that I think Miguel's work points out is this decoupling between description of the deterministic dynamics of the system versus the average dynamics of an ensemble of systems, right? So in prior accounts of the free energy principle, you actually write the deterministic dynamics into your description. So when you're using free energy principle to do cognitive systems, you are describing the deterministic dynamics directly in terms of your expectations and flows on your expectations. But what the particular physics approach wants to do is try to find that deterministic dynamics within the physics, right? It wants to see where it would lie within the kind of general stochastic dynamical systems theories of physics. And that's where the problems lie, right? So it's very hard to go from the physics to the description in terms, a good description of the system in terms of the kind of dynamics on expectations and so on in that system. So we find this problem of a decoupling between the description and the dynamics of the moments of a system versus the average over an ensemble of systems. This is where the problem lies, right? So over an ensemble systems, the free energy might be a good description, but it's not connected to the causal explanation of the dynamics of a specific system. So you can't attribute kind of the right kind of mechanistic description to that particular system that you would like to. And yeah, so that's kind of my summary, maybe. Of.
Thank you for the succinct summary. That's very helpful for many, I'm sure. Baron, if you'd like to unmute. Sorry, I heard a feedback when Chris was speaking. So if you can unmute or... yep, okay. Please introduce yourself and then give any comments you'd like, and then I'll go to the questions.
Yeah, sure. So hi, I'm Baron. I'm obviously an author on this, and I'm currently now a postdoc at Oxford, but I worked very closely with Chris and Miguel at Sussex for a long time. So yeah, also sorry I'm late. I had something else, scheduling conflicts. I just jumped in for the questions. But yeah, so I would just I think Chris did an excellent job of explaining the issue with the average dynamics versus the dynamics of the average. But I would just like to go in and kind of reiterate, to me, an important thing about the Markov blankets is really this idea that there is a huge distinction between the sort of statistical independence relationships and the kind of causal actual relationships you get if you write out the dynamics. And so it's quite easy to confuse these two. And indeed, I think we naturally conflated these two a lot until we started writing this paper. And a lot of the literature also conflates these two, and they have these intuitive diagrams of the bacteria with its cell wall and everything, and that's the blanket and so forth. But that's in the sort of causal level of the description, and the things causally have to pass through the blanket. But that's not the same at all as the statistical description, which is the statistical independencies between the blanket and the internal and the external states. And I think it needs quite a lot of thinking about to what extent these causal mappings actually hold up and sort of actually are sustained by the statistical mappings, or vice versa. And we've found in linear systems there's a lot of cases where they don't, and they don't seem to match at all. And so it takes a lot of kind of different intuitions, really, I think, need to be built about what these Markov blankets mean on an actual sort of causal level.
Thanks for this comment. And again, people can write questions. If I could just actually add something about the difference between the causal structure and the correlative structure, you could imagine on a market, there's companies that are causally related to each other, but their stock prices are not correlated. And similarly in the cell, we often make networks that are based upon gene co-expression, so genes with correlated expression, and then there's gene regulatory networks or protein-protein interaction networks that are like proteins that touch. But those proteins usually don't have correlated expression because you might upregulate one that then represses another, so they're not expressed in a correlated fashion, but they have causal relationships. So and it's people slipping between, a gene regulatory network, co-expression interactions, certainly conflating the causal structure of a system with the physical structure or the correlative structure is a broad category error. And I think your work does an incredible job at highlighting the difference and where slipping between these easily confusable modes of thinking about networks, and then also conflating that with reality or all of reality. Just very well done to these points.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, another example would be the difference between structural connectivity, functional connectivity, and effective connectivity in the brain, right? You can have some structure, and then you can have statistical correlations, but even then the dynamics can behave differently because you have these asymmetries in how one variable is connected to another and the opposite. And this is also in our work, the relation with the solenoidal flows that capture something different. So it's in general very complicated to disentangle all these different levels.
But to do justice to the authors, I think they're aware of this difference. Obviously, Carl's group is very aware of this difference, but they feel that the theory sits above that, right, at the correlative structures, and they're not considering those causal structures. I think maybe some confusion might have emerged in previous papers, but in recent papers, I think it's very clear that they want to sit above the causal interactions.
Yeah.
Cool. So I hope that by bringing the math to examples of the market, evolution, and fMRI, we can hopefully have a lot of people giving their perspective. So I'm going to just go with a question from the chat, and then I have some questions that I wrote down. So first question. Thanks a lot. I was wondering whether you would assume that going to nonlinear systems, the limitations that you find would be even stronger, or would there maybe be an argument that there could be nonlinear systems that fulfill these assumptions? So what will relaxing the linear assumption do for the math that you described today?
Okay. Well, that's a difficult to answer question in general, I think. So So okay, so first is I think it's difficult to, well, it's difficult to solve because in nonlinear systems in general we cannot find the kind of analytical solutions that we have here, right? And even in the case of linear systems, we found that we can only solve the case of weak couplings. And in the case of weak couplings, we could do the trick of considering different orders of expansions, and we saw that including stronger couplings make things more difficult rather than easier. Okay, and intuitively, at least my intuition about nonlinear systems is that the case may be similar in many systems, right? Having having more intricate couplings, more intricate dynamical couplings could add extra terms to some of the matrices that we are expecting to be zero, like in the Markov blanket. But still, this is not something we can say, because or you could have, I don't know, unexpected effects from chaos, for example, and I think that's something that Carl proposes sometimes. But I don't know, I think maybe one interesting direction of research could be doing a similar expansion to the one that we did, to say, okay, we have an almost linear system, but we consider very small effects of nonlinearity and see what kind of terms this adds to the matrices that we are expecting. So this will involve a very different analytical solution, but I think there is some forthcoming work from some people in Carl's group in that sense. So I think it's an open question, but I intuitively think that in many cases this is going to be challenging to continue, to see that nonlinearity is going to be a solution.
Mm. I mean, the intuition is that you might be able to solve it in specific systems, but you know, the idea that you'll solve it in a class of nonlinear systems seems doubtful, right? But you might be able to find examples that which you augment with nonlinearities that meet the criteria. Maybe if you constrain yourself to a particular evolved living system, that might be okay, right? But if you want to say something more general about the emergent self-organization in a class of physical systems, then perhaps run into trouble.
Two thoughts on that. Go ahead, Baron, first. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that I think, I agree with Chris, and that obviously with nonlinear systems, you have a much bigger space of systems, and so you can probably find, edge cases where all the conditions match perfectly. But I mean, the general intuition in dynamical systems is the nonlinear systems are a lot harder to deal with in general, and so I'm not going to probably, if it's not satisfied in linear systems, there's no obvious reason why it should be satisfied in nonlinear systems. And especially the issue with the dynamics of the average versus the average of the dynamics. Like the case we did where you have a linear Gaussian system is probably the ideal possible case for this, because obviously the average is a linear operator, and for the Gaussian case, the mode and the actual average are the same. And so you have all these nice properties, none of which will hold in the nonlinear general case. And so I think, for that, nonlinear systems are almost certainly going to be much worse for that specific issue.
Yeah. Also to add on that, I think so one question is whether there is linear systems in which some of the problems are going to go away, but maybe the right question is what happens in the kind of nonlinear systems that we expect in living systems, right? And what we know from living systems often involves bifurcations or critical points that lead to long-range correlations and correlations that propagate through the whole system and this kind of thing that can be very difficult. So the kind of isolation between internal and external states can be challenging in when this is the case, right?
Thanks for all these excellent points. In complexity, we often talk about nonlinear as being like non-elephant animals. It's like all of them. So it's even harder, certainly, to make a general stance. And Baron, that was a really interesting point that as the state space of what's possible increases, there may be more and more edge cases. And that kind of brings it back to the question about evolved systems. Not every parameter combination of cells is going to be functional. And so maybe we're only dealing with that vanishingly small amount or some other, I'm not going to go into technical details on the fly, but that could be one aspect. And also, it was such an interesting point during the discussion when you explicitly brought it back to evolution. Like, fitness is the law of the land in a way, at a level that doesn't explain motor behavior in the moment to moment. They're nested timescales, and so of course there's motor behavior that's maladaptive. In long run, you wouldn't see that under a stationary ecology and ... You start adding some assumptions in, and it's just, I think, a very fruitful mapping that will be explored for time to come with the relationship between population level claims under stationary environments, population level claims under dynamical environments, and then individual level claims under stationary and changing environments. So there's just a lot of topics that come into play, and to have them integrate these kinds of points that you're raising, which are often implicit errors in other areas, they're being drawn together and brought to the forefront in a way that is quite novel. Okay. Again, since the technical details, I believe, stand best in the presentation as you provided, as well as in the paper, we can take any questions, but I think that will be the place where the discussion continues. I just kind of wanted to ask a few other questions to provide a little context. So for maybe whoever wants to answer, how did you come to be studying the question this way? Were you working with the FEP and exploring new kinds of math, or did you have more of experience with the mathematics and then see the FEP coming up onto the radar? Like, how did each of you come to be working on it this way?
Okay.
Yeah. I'll go because I think Miguel can follow. But so I mean, I wrote a review a few years ago now of the original energy principle, and at that time it was quite an enigmatic principle. Not many people understood it. I mean, the reason originally I didn't like it, I didn't like the idea of the notion of representation. Seems to be pregnant in the idea of the free energy principle, kind of representing generative models. But I actually came to like it as a cognitive framework, and I still do like it as a cognitive framework. And I still think within the regime of describing essentially motor loops and abstract sensing and cognitive systems, it's very, very useful. But then obviously there's been a rapid development of the free energy principle into a grander claim, right? To find this principle in physics, in the class of physical systems. And that's where kind of I started working with Miguel. Miguel's got a real strong background in statistical physics, and that's basically what's led us to this, to kind of really go back to some of those assumptions. So I do separate the two things. I think there's I'm very find the cognitive account very appealing, even though we find these problems in these physics examples.
Yeah, in my case, all the for some, I think I started to be involved with the principle more recently. For sometimes that is something that I had on the radar, but actually understand it, what it meant. It's always seemed kind of scary and challenging, like through the equations, and I guess that part of the motivation for doing this work it was as a way of understanding what the theory consisted of, because you could go through the mathematical descriptions and it's often really hard to know what they imply or what they mean exactly, in the sense that they are complicated maths, right? And I guess that during my research career, the way I had for understanding complicated maths is by building models, and this understanding by building philosophy that so I think that the initial attempts to build this system, it was an attempt to really understand, okay, this step I can grasp mathematically more or less what it means, but let's have a model and change parameters and play with it and so on, right? So that was more or less the journey and once having the model, then say, okay, can I have something more general than just some specific parameters? So let's see how we can have an analytical solution, and so on. So I think this exercise is very fruitful, both on a personal level and also on a scientific level, because you can, on your way to learning, you can develop things that can be useful for the theory more in general.
Awesome. Thank you for those answers, Baron. And also, I was just getting feedback right now from you, Miguel. So just mute while Baron gives a yeah. Okay, go ahead, Baron.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Miguel's point really about just the importance of actually trying to build these models, because I think, from my perspective, a lot of the sort of developments and problems we discovered basically came from actually looking at specific models and thinking, hey, this doesn't quite work out as it says it should, and hey, because basically things have just become an awful lot more clearer if you actually try and build them rather than just staring at these sort of symbols on the page. And so I think that was really the key to a lot of it. Is simply trying to construct a system where this works and then say, hey, things aren't going quite as the particular physics monograph says they should be.
Cool. And it's so interesting and maybe even appropriate that action became relevant for this inference problem. So it's not just conceptual, because we must be engaging in the literature and conversation and the work and going through it ourselves in order to infer deeper. We can't just wait at square one and look all the way to square 1000. We have to be working along the way individually and maybe as a group too. So here's a question from the chat. Brilliant talk. Wonder if Carl and others will respond to challenges presented in this paper. Also, because the paper is written in such coherent style, wonder what would you recommend for beginners to study in the FEP? Nice question. What do you wish you knew at the outset, even if it's a new resource? What courses or topics would you recommend having a familiarity with, or what are the on-ramps for somebody who's not in this area of research and practice? How can they best be on-ramping themselves?
So I recommend Baron's GitHub. He's got a nice repository of papers, which go from very introductory papers to very sophisticated papers in nicely organized ways. I don't know if you want to provide that, Baron. Is it publicly accessible?
Oh yeah, it's publicly accessible. Yeah, I could post that in the chat or something if you want.
Yeah, say hello in the YouTube chat, and then I'll make you a moderator, and you can post links. So great.
Okay, yeah.
So then,
okay, well,
continue on that.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the actual question about what to sort of start with, I think that depends a lot on what you want to do. So there's kind of sort of three big separate topics in my mind. Is there's sort of the FEP, the sort of hardcore maths of the theory, as is presented in particular physics. And for that, I'm not sure there is necessarily a good beginner's level resource at this point. Like there is essentially, I mean, our paper tries to go through it quite straightforwardly, and then you have the Thomas Parr Markov Blankets and Stochastic Thermodynamics paper, which sort of covers the main points, but is not like a tutorial. It kind of states like this is X, Y, Z. And then really it's just the particular physics monograph is where most of that information is. Like there isn't yet a really nice laying out of it. And obviously we kind of try and do that in our paper, but obviously we're also focused on the actual points we want to make. It's not just like specifically tutorial. Yeah, I mean, the other two things are obviously the active inference, sort of discrete state-based active inference that people talk a lot about. I think the best resource for that at the moment is probably Lancelot da Costa's review on that. And then there's essentially there's several of Carl's papers, which I think I talk about in my GitHub repository, which is kind of going into more detail, but Lance's review for that is really good. And then there's a sort of more continuous state-based predictive coding style, which I think Chris's 2017 review is the best for that, to be honest. So yeah, those are the places I would start. And Raphael's, yeah. Raphael's. Yeah, I think Chris's one is the one if you want to sort of understand the theory and all the math as a whole, because it walks through very nicely. Whereas Raphael's like if you want to build a predictive coding network which works and you have that sort of more focused on the neuroscience of it, Raphael's is the way to go.
If I can ask one note before Miguel's answer, when you said newer science, do you see them as just historically juxtaposed, or do you see some of these approaches as encompassing one another or being prerequisite to one another?
So I think the idea is that the sort of FEP in the particular physics monograph encompasses all of them, in that the idea is that these are just specific models. You have a specific variational density, specific generative model, and then you work through the maths and you get these process theories, as Carl calls them, out. I mean, I think in practice though they can stand alone away from whatever the particular physics monograph says, because they obviously make empirical predictions about the brain or whatever. And so you can actually empirically test these. And so even if all particular physics is wrong, then these things could be right and vice versa. So even if all particular physics is perfectly right, and these things could just not be what the brain is doing, it could be doing something else. So yeah, I think they stand alone, although in theory, the particular physics monograph is kind of meant to subsume them all.
Thanks for that response. And Miguel, to that original question, what would you recommend a beginner to be learning and looking into?
Yeah, I'm not so sure. For me, so I think I started with Thomas Barr paper about Markov blankets and information geometry, and then going back to the monograph of a particular physics, but it was challenging because it's like the maths are complex, and yeah, it was, and I kind of liked, it was useful to Martin Bill's paper, a technical critique of the free energy principle, in the sense it was very technical and formal, but it was useful that they tried to encapsulate the different conditions in a way similar to what we do here, and I think that was helpful to try to differentiate the different steps, which are not always so clear in the literature. So yeah, I think there is, at least for the part regarding the free energy principle as described in a particular physics, we need maybe better tutorials and better, more materials that are focused to as introductions. Yeah.
Thanks for these responses. And I know in our ActInf lab and in many other associated efforts that the focus on accessibility and communicating these ideas in a way that's going to be helpful to people from many backgrounds is a top priority. So way back in the introduction, 120 time steps ago, you talked about new visualizations. And it's definitely the case that paper after paper will use some classical figures, let's just say. And I'm excited by visualizations, and so was curious, just maybe whoever wants to go in for it, what would the new representations do or be, communicate, what style, or what made you just wanting to explore visually? And how is that in feedback with the research?
Okay, yeah, I think that's interesting. Like at some point, I keep looking through the literature, and it's paper after paper the same graph about brain, sensory motor loop, the bacillus, and so on. And yeah, so at some point it stops being useful, right? Because each visualization can give unique intuitions to some extent, right? And at some point I wanted to know more about it. So it was not always straightforward. Okay, there's an arrow, but what does it mean? Or why is this bidirectional? So the different figures that we have, we developed them with the idea of, okay, how can we intuitively express these very complex assumptions? And I don't know, how do you have a figure of a solenoidal flow? And this is really challenging, and I think I'm not sure if we did a good job there, but I think I think many intuitions about the free energy principle are really hard to capture because they are quite complex, and I think it's interesting to try to push in the directions of having new images that at least try to capture that intuitions and what do they mean and how to because often I think you have to read the theory based on your intuition, or covering with intuitions the part that you don't understand yet, especially if you're learning, and this kind of thing I think is incredibly useful in general in science, right?
Chris or Baron, would you like to add on that point?
No, I mean, just that we found it hard, right? I mean, because there is so many different types of interactions we want to represent. I mean, typically monolithic arrows between agent and environment seems to dominate everything, right? But when you start drilling down into this, you have the difference between causal and functional. Obviously, people like Pearl and stuff have done this in the philosophy, right? They've been very clear about different types of interaction. But I think in especially in modeling work, it's become a bit clouded in lots of applications, especially in the area of the free energy principle. But yeah, I don't know whether I think Miguel did a really good job, but it does look complicated. The final product is complicated looking, right? But it does do justice to these different types of interaction. Yeah.
Baron, anything on that, or no? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, I would just say that I agree. Like, I'm not naturally a sort of visual person who actually really looks at the figures, but I think just what Miguel did was actually really good, and it's the sort of thing that if you actually look at them and try and understand them, it will yield a lot of dividends in terms of quickly getting to grasp on precisely what's being said, what's not being said. Because yeah, it's very easy to have into this sort of hazy interaction without knowing what that really means.
Mm.
It's the same, again, as a geneticist, it makes me think of, oh, nodes are genes and edges are interactions. Which kind of those multiple classes, and does one paper use it one way and go to the methods and it's one way in this paper and it's another one in another way, but it's being cited. And so it takes a lot of subtlety to pull back to that question about what kind of interactions are being discussed. And then, Chris, what you just said, there's like, it's a high praise for the work that it does justice, because that's what we hope the bleeding edge does for the rest of the knife and the handle, is represent visually on a manifold that doesn't deceive. It's not drawing hard lines where none exist. It's not making false positive or false negatives or false claims visually, because visual rhetoric is how many people will learn and think about these things. And so it makes all the difference whether there's a bidirectional arrow graphically or not, because people are going to unpack it, especially if they're not going to go into the nth level of math. They're going to unpack it literally and with the knowledge that that's what the expert represented in their aim.
So yeah, I really do think it's particularly important for this field, because there is a separation between this technical morass that sits at the bottom and obviously the ambition and what it promises. So many people are attracted to this particular theory, and then but not everyone has got time to go in and decipher that morass. So they're sitting at the level of these figures and trying to make discourse and so on at that level. So it's vital that those figures become very clear and very pointed in what they try to communicate. And any kind of lack of clarity is just going to send the whole community off in the wrong direction, particularly if you're not the kind of person who wants to go in and do the statistical physics. You want to do more of the philosophy or cognitive science of these systems. So it's vital that we get them right in this particular field, particularly, I think.
Yes, it's I think there's an XKCD cartoon, about where the fields are arranged, but especially when working with the theory itself, it should be lean and as low dimensional as possible, and not anymore, because otherwise it will be unpacked in ways that are just going to be completely discordant. But if it can be represented in sort of like a build-in or like an opt-in at this level, instead of trying to explain backwards from what we could do in the future in the math, we need to start with the axioms and clarify what they are, and then unpack those. And then it's like, just like with any other area of theory, did you disagree with the axioms, or did you disagree with how they were applied? Because those are the areas where there's sort of controlled space for discussion. But then something like, I don't think it would work that way in a human computer interface, it's neither here nor there for the level of rigor that you approach the questions with today.
Yeah.
So I can ask any other questions, or we can see if anyone else posts in the chat. But that was actually one of my questions, was, are those all the axioms? How do we represent axioms, or how do we even know what those axioms are without getting into like too much of a whole, incompleteness thing? What are the axioms? Were they what you put in the paper and nothing else? Those are necessary and sufficient, or is there some other stuff happening?
Actually, it's our ambition, just to say before, I think I'll let Miguel answer that, but we have an ambition to write a kind of more accessible version of this paper, which hopefully will be done in the next few months. So we want to do exactly that. We want to draw away from the hard statistical physics and have this paper underneath it, but then even be more clear about the kind of overall narrative of what we're suggesting here. And we can answer those questions that you asked very directly, hopefully. But for the specific case, I'll let Miguel answer.
Unmute and then continue. Thank you.
I don't have much to add. Yes, that I think that the free energy principle is has been an evolving theory, and there is different versions of it through the different papers in the 10 years that it has been being proposed, and at least for me it was a difficult job to try to summarize the theory in that way, or to have the exact connections of steps, because also sometimes some descriptions are verbal, but I think that's important. An important avenue for continuing the research in this field is try to do more accessible descriptions, or try to encapsulate them in this way, or try to show the sequence more clearly, or at least for an introductory purpose, right?
Yeah, it's been very much a living theory, the free energy principle. I found this when I wrote the review back in the day, which is that there is this development that's very clear in the series of publications that comes out, and I think things have changed, obviously, as they develop. So trying to see the consistency across those types of things, which is the fundamental axiom and which is later introduced and so on, is very difficult, actually. And again, I don't criticize the authors of this, because I think it is a living theory. It's something that's kind of really evolved in the literature. It's a very complex one, so it had to be like that. But hopefully, as we go forward in the next few years, we can become more clear about these things, and there'll be more and more people doing reviews and more critical evaluations like Miguel's done, which will further ground this theory in a place where we can all agree on the axioms. Yeah.
And also,
and I just want to say, sorry,
Baron, and then Miguel.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say that we should definitely not consider all the axioms of the free energy principle at the moment to be completely sort of fixed in stone. Like, I feel this is still living and still evolving in many ways. And there's some cases where there's questions about, do we actually need this axiom? Can it be more general than this? Can it be less general than this? And stuff. So I think there's going to be a lot of more foundational discussion around the actual axioms underlying it. So, and now that people are just really just starting to tackle particular physics in a really deep way, that I think that there will, over the next few years, be lots of discussion about this. And hopefully in a couple of years, we'll have a much more sort of precise statement of, what the FEP says, what is needed, what isn't needed, and, how everything fits together. But at the moment, it's still in a fair bit of flux, because really deep critique outside of Carl's group on particular physics is kind of just really starting in the last year or so.
Thanks for that, Miguel.
Yes. Also want to add that. Okay, so we focus on the free energy principle and this claim that dynamical systems or self-organizing systems behave as minimizing the free energy, but I think that's only one part of the universe of the free energy principle. You have the active inference, you have the design of systems that explicitly minimize the free energy, and that's a completely different field. And often this is also mixed and not sure, and there's sometimes a mix between, which is the axioms that are even in specific papers, where you are situated in your work is not always clear for anyone, because of this evolving this evolution of the theory and these interconnections and so on. But I think that becoming more mature, as the field becomes more mature, this will be clear, because sometimes this leads to confusion about what the theory means. When people say, okay, the free energy principle shows that every living system is minimizing free energy. Oh, okay, but it's so it's different when you think of agents that do it by design, or when you try to extend the claim to other systems. And so there is these different points of view and these different sides of the theory that I hope I imagine that they are going to evolve into more compartmentalized, or even if they are interconnected, but in a way that they are clearer, the borders of the different claims and so on.
It's going to be an FEP metaverse that is appropriate for the online age, honestly, because when I think about how the needle was pushed here, GitHub and interactive computational notebooks, preprints like yours, live streams like the one that we're on, a Discord server, a reading group that was arranged by Maxwell and others, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would have been like, what? and it certainly wouldn't have been accessible globally. So to see how the material and the informational culture and also social culture is changing in a time when participatory science and open science and all these kinds of transdisciplinary ideas are coming to the fore, it's just an awesome contribution. So I'll offer any final thoughts from the chat and each of you a final word, but just to say from the lab that we really appreciate your willingness to, jump on short notice and work on it and share it in this way, and also with these exciting directions that you've planned out and expect.
I'd just like to say I completely agree with you, and I have to, a shout out to people like Maxwell Ramstead who organise these Discord servers, which are, really promulgating this debate in wide communities, which are really valuable for as infrastructure for us, people like us, to come in and do this type of research. So yeah, I completely agree with that. This new infrastructure there is really important for this type of stuff.
Baron, any last comments? And then Miguel, of course,
Yeah.
that final word.
I just want to echo what Chris said really about just the sheer importance of the reading group Maxwell organized, because I think that's where, I learned an awful lot about how particular physics works and how everything goes through in that monograph. And I think a lot of people did there as well. Like, I think that reading group's what really built up enough expertise to, make papers like this and obviously similar to modern stuff, and just generally get everything together. And probably lots of stuff in the next year or so coming out actually made all of that possible, really. And so, yeah, also just as a final, like, if you're interested in learning more about the FEP, like, email Maxwell, because he has recordings of all the reading group meetings. And so that's probably going to be a really good resource.
For a good another lockdown, I think.
Yeah, so yeah, a lot of recordings. There'll be lots of material there. So yeah, if you want to really drill down into technicalities, then those recordings will probably be really good as well.
Great. And Miguel, if you would like to give any last comments.
Yeah, yes, well, just as you said, as I think, yeah, on partly as Chris and Brian said, I kind of joined late to the group and just attended to the last sessions, but it was really helpful to dig through some of the discussions that took place there. And I think in general, what could make the field advance is to make things accessible in different ways, and this can be through resources, through communities, and also through more transparent models or more easier to follow guides through the maps. And I think the part of the difficulties in the field is that there is a disconnection between people that is doing mathematical work and people that is doing philosophical work, and not only here, but I think in cognitive science in general, or even in more deeper views of systems biology and so on, right? And that this multi-level, yeah, I think it's very valuable, these efforts in trying to make things more accessible and easier to follow for people from multiple disciplines. I think that's a very valuable effort that we should try to do collectively, because that's the only way. And thanks a lot for hosting the session.
Thank you. We always talk about tools, ideas, and people. They're a triple helix, and so thanks for making it happen with all of those today.
Thank you very much for that.
Peace.